Everybody, hope you're doing well. So here's the thing. The gospel for today is John 10, verses 1 to 10. And what that is Jesus speaking about being the shepherd, right? Being the good shepherd. So I want to read to you. Just read. I don't normally do that, but I'm going to read some to you today. Um, and just, there's one piece that just absolutely baffles me. I think this is the most straightforward thing you could possibly read, right? Truly, truly, I say to you, he who doesn't enter the sheepfold by the door, so you'll know, a sheepfold is the place where they gather the sheep at night. There might be multiple flocks in there, but it was a place where they're protected. And so if there's multiple flocks, then the shepherds can take shifts, keeping watch. So at any rate, he who doesn't enter the sheepfold by the door, but climbs in another way, that man's a thief and a robber. Everybody clear on that? Anybody confused by that? You'll see in a minute why I'm saying that. But he who enters by the door is the shepherd of the sheep. To him, the gatekeeper opens. Y'all pretty clear with that? Okay. The sheep hear his voice, and he calls his sheep by name and he leads them out. When he has brought out all his own, he goes before them, and the sheep follow him, for they know his voice. A stranger they won't follow, but they will flee from him, for they don't know the voice of a stranger. Y'all clear? Y'all clear? Is there anything I need to tell you here? Is there anything I need to bring up to date on, up to speed? Or are you feeling pretty confident you know this now? The figure of speech Jesus used with them. Here's the part that explains why I did this. But they didn't understand what he was saying to them. I bet you did. Even if you don't believe that Jesus is the Messiah, I bet you understood that parable. I bet you didn't struggle with it at all. There's nothing to struggle with. I mean, the only thing that you might not understand is what's a sheepfold? What does it mean there's a gatekeeper? It's just one of the shepherds. The first one in gets to keep the gate because he knows the other shepherds. And in the morning, when they lead the sheep out, one shepherd at a time goes out, calls his sheep, and those sheep follow him. There are probably exceptions now that some will and go after him, and nope, that's not yours. No, you don't belong with me. So, but that's it. That's the whole thing. And he says they won't follow a stranger. They didn't understand it. Not hard, really simple to follow. But they didn't understand it. So why did they not understand it? What explains that? Well, cognitive dissonance is the easiest thing to say. And what that would indicate is sort of like the same thing when the disciples don't recognize Jesus, right? The disciples on the road to Emmaus, Mary Magdalene, they don't recognize it. Why? It doesn't fit the paradigm they already have established. And that can be our biggest problem. It can be sometimes why the gospel doesn't challenge us and why we never seem to change the way we think about anything is because, well, we've already made up our mind about it. We've already made up our mind about this, that, and the other thing. And so we get locked into something and we reject any information to the contrary. Well, so how does that apply here, John? Well, it applies this way. So Psalm 23, who wrote it? David. What was David's job before he became king? Shepherd, right? So is David writing Psalm 23 about himself? No, he's writing from his experience of having been a shepherd, and he knows then what a good shepherd would do and how they would relate to the sheep. They would make sure they had good grazing land. They would make sure they had water. They would make sure that they were safe. They would inspect. That's the point of the staff, that they're inspecting and making sure they're healthy. They do all the things necessary to make sure the flock thrives. That's the point of a shepherd. Make sure they thrive in any situation. Even if there are enemies around, they make sure that they're safe and that you can prepare a table before me in the midst of mine enemies. And I can eat knowing that I'm secure. And so, who is the good shepherd that David's talking about? Does anybody struggle with who the good shepherd is that David's talking about? I don't think so. I don't think anybody thinks, well, that's just David. He's just talking about himself. No, nobody thinks that. What was amazing to me was for a while when I first was ordained, the first congregation I actually had was in an Alzheimer's unit, in a memory care unit, whatever you want to call it, in Pawleys Island. And one of the things that we did, what we realized very early on, was just that it kind of didn't matter who you were or what tradition you might have come up in. Every single time that I was there, it was every other week, we said the 23rd Psalm together, and we would sing Amazing Grace together. For whatever reason, it was perfectly common. Everybody knew it. We didn't have handouts, didn't need them. People who couldn't remember who their wife was, who the husband was, who the children were. When we said the 23rd Psalm, man, everybody in the room did it with me. Every single one. Sing Amazing Grace. Everybody sings it. Not every verse, but but that's something that's there, so deeply embedded in their hearts. And then so we get that in if that pointing to God as the good shepherd. So Jesus is claiming to be, well, God. And then when you get to Ezekiel and Zechariah, they tell stories that God will ultimately come and shepherd the flock, and He will get rid of the other shepherds who were there, who were bad shepherds. Well, everybody knows who those people are. They're the leaders. Period. End of sentence. God's going to come shepherd the flock. So when Jesus tells this parable, the one thing they can't get their heads around is He's claiming to be that, and so they can't figure it out. It's not like they don't understand sort of the metaphor, the parable, or whatever. It's just, how's that apply? What do you mean when you say that? It's absolutely amazing. Jesus is making this very clear about who He is, but they didn't get the figure of speech because they couldn't imagine. They could not imagine that the person telling them this story, sitting in front of them as He told it, was claiming to be God, the one who will come and be the fulfillment of the prophecies of Ezekiel and Zechariah, who will be that one that David describes in Psalm 23. I understand why they couldn't get their head around that. It's not something that you could even begin to imagine. And so what we need to do, and the way we need to fight this, is to examine our presuppositions all the time. We need to examine them about the gospel. We need to examine them about all kinds of things. We need to have what Gad Saad, who is a Canadian psychologist, says we need to have epistemological humility. That's a big term to say what I'm trying to say, which is I need to examine what I think I know and maybe say, I don't know that, think that. I don't know that. And so to examine those presuppositions is incredibly important in every field of endeavor, frankly. I can remember a time years and years ago, and that's 30 years ago. We had an assignment. I was working in Tampa, had an assignment there. The city of Tampa came to us. They were struggling with certain things about their transportation system. By that, I mean their buses primarily. And they wanted us to do sort of an overview and a study to see what could or should be done. So I went through it and did everything that I needed to do to pull this study together. And then in the middle of this, I had an idea. And so what I did was I started calling cab companies. There were, I don't know, maybe a dozen cab companies in Tampa at that time. And I called all of them. And I had done the statistical analysis to know X number of riders and the average distance that a rider would take on the bus. And so I called the cab companies and I divided, just took that big number, divided it by 12 and started calling cab companies. And I called them and said, if I could promise you, X number of riders and the average distance would be this, and we were trying to do this on a contract basis, what would it cost? And so they gave me prices. Everybody gave me a price, and I took all these things down. And so I've done my study, but the last day before we were going to sit down with the people we were preparing it for, I just did this. And it didn't take that long. I just called them all and told them what it was. And they gave me a quote. So I quoted all of them, and it's okay, fine. I went down and sat down with my partner and said, Steve, here's what I've done. He said, wow, that's really fascinating. He said, let's go meet with them the next day. So we had breakfast meeting the next day and I laid it out for them, their study out for them. And Steve said, look, this isn't part of what we build for, but I want John to present something for you. And so I presented it to him and said, so here's the thing, we could save a huge amount of money if we went to a different model of moving people from place to place. And the model would be this. It would be contracted with cab companies to provide riders for the cab companies and to provide um, for the riders, to get them where they were. And the benefit would be they would get picked up where they were and taken to exactly where they wanted to be at exactly the times they wanted to do these things. Could all be set up in advance, be very simple to make it all happen. And we would save all this money. So you know what the answer was? World-class cities have buses. Why? What's the purpose of the bus? What's the purpose of that transportation system? Right? Well, this is a better way to do it. It gets people where they want to go, when they want to be there, and it's cheaper and it saves the city a ton of money. In fact, you could do it without even charging the people to do it and save money. I mean, it was that big a deal, and they just couldn't get their head around it. So I created Uber. I just don't get any credit for it and didn't make any money out of it. At any rate, but that's the way we need to think about problem solving in some ways, is that we need to be able to say, I come to this with a whole lot of presuppositions. And we need to do that when we hear Jesus. If we're going to hear him and it's going to strike a chord in us and cause us to think more deeply and to maybe make changes in our lives, then we maybe need to examine our presuppositions so we don't get caught in this cognitive dissonance trap on a regular basis. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.